everybody, to episode 119 of Axioms on Trial. And today we're going to be talking to Planet Peterson. Welcome. Thanks for coming back.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we're going to be reviewing the previous episode where Artemis, a friend of mine, and I were having a conversation, kind of a debate with two creationists who don't believe in the kind of evolution that is agreed upon in the scientific field, the scientific consensus. And Peterson, I know that you debated one of them on
It
your.
was both of them.
Oh, it was both of them. Okay.
Yep.
And I know that you said you wanted to go over some of the claims they've made, and you wrote down basically what their arguments were. And yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, so I watched the debate that was on your channel, and it was really kind of like the first 15 minutes-ish, if memory serves me correct. There were just so many different things that were said that there were errors, and that I thought, oh, these need to be addressed. But instead, the subject kept getting changed over and over again, which is kind of frustrating. But that happens. That's how a lot of debates typically tend to go.
I was struggling to keep it on track. Like I was trying to get back to each claim, but it kept getting lost.
Yeah. So one of the very first things, for example, that they said was that their problem with evolution isn't science, it isn't the Bible, it's science.
Right.
So they don't. They claim that they don't attack it from like a biblical lens, but rather they think the science doesn't back up evolution. So there's a few reasons why I think that that's kind of weird and doesn't really match. So they talk a lot about genetic entropy. When I debated them, that was the only thing we talked about for like 2.5 hours, pretty much. So they both believe in evolution and evolution by natural selection, because they believe that there was a flood and that there were animals on the ark. And after the animals came off of the ark, there weren't 1.5 million species on the ark. There were only maybe a few thousand, and they radiated rapidly after that. And by talking to them, they basically told me, yes, evolution by natural selection does occur. They just think that, again, it all happened not very long ago, very rapidly. But genetic entropy is almost totally incompatible with natural selection. I want to talk about genetic entropy specifically more later, but I just wanted to discuss that from the beginning. They say it was the science that they don't agree with, and there's other inconsistencies there too.
To which I said that from my perspective, they don't understand the science because they think that evolution works like Pokemon.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, like theoretically, if a flood happened, then species could radiate into subspecies rapidly. I mean, it's not impossible, but the data does not back up that ever happened on Earth, right? But it is quite fanciful. I don't think it's nearly as parsimonious to think it happened that way rather than slowly over millions and tens and hundreds of millions of years.
But I also go through like these misconceptions about what a kind is and the kind of the usual creationist talking points that's like don't actually cover the way in which science understands these topics.
Yeah, to them a kind is are like the families. So so the mammals is the kingdom, phylum, I believe mammal is a class, right? And then you have kingdom, phylum, class, and then order, and then family, right? So I looked up like how many animal families there are. This was a few weeks ago, and I think the number was like 5,000 or 6,000. So it's not a huge number. So that's, they say the closest thing to what a kind is that, but a kind is just not well defined.
Yeah,
obviously. It's defined as whatever it needs to be for this to work, kind of, sort of, in a way. So without getting too far ahead into like genetic entropy or whatever, one of the things that was talked about was the inbreeding coefficient. Artemis brought that up, but it didn't go into very much detail. But um, this inbreeding coefficient is essentially you measure how much genetic diversity you have, I believe, and then you test to see if you have inbreeding, what is the rate at which like harmful mutations are going to pile up to where the population is basically unsustainable. I believe it's something like that. But what they countered that with, they claimed, well, we don't see the effects of inbreeding after mass extinctions, which was their way of saying like, I don't think this inbreeding coefficient thing is necessarily always true or backed
Right.
up by evidence or whatever. Now, the problem with that is they were, because Artemis brought that up because of the arc. I should have mentioned that. Sorry. So she said if you only had two somewhere between a pair or 7 pairs for like the unclean animals, whatever it says there, if you only have 2 or 14 or whatever individuals coming off of an arc, they cannot sustain their population.
Right.
That's how that all originally got brought up. And then they said, well, it doesn't happen after mass extinctions. So what they're doing there is you're equivocating a mass extinction with having only between like 2 to 14 organisms to produce all future organisms. Mass extinctions do not leave behind, single digit numbers of a species.
Right.
Like, for example, for humans, the Toba eruption that happened like 70,000 years ago, we think that brought humans down to around 5,000 members.
That's
Definitely
crazy.
not 2. But even if a mass extinction did eliminate all but 2 somehow members of a species, they would pretty much certainly go extinct, because stuff like this has happened before. Mammoths on Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island is this island between Russia and Alaska. And when the pyramids were being built, there were still mammoths on Wrangel Island, which is really fascinating. Now, they went extinct almost certainly because it's an island and there just weren't enough mammoths to preserve genetic diversity. They got on that island in the first place because sea levels dropped. And so it was just connected to mainland. At that point, Asia was connected to North America. That was a weird period in Earth's history. There were only 3 continents: Antarctica, Australia, and then Africa, Europe, Asia, North and South America were all connected. But then they got isolated there, and eventually their numbers were just too small and the inbreeding took over. That's probably why mammoths on Channel Island off the coast of California went extinct too. So yeah, that was the that was the first thing, just kind of like a false equivalence, I guess. Do you remember that part of the conversation?
Yeah. I mean, a lot was said there, but I remember that part of the conversation a little bit, not super well, but
yeah. So that was thing number 1. Thing number 2, something they said is that the gene code gets less complex over time.
that I remember, and that's not accurate, right? Like just the idea of like subtracting from that's, I don't think, very scientific.
Yeah, well, they so there I would be interested to see some data on this, because there are ways in which it could almost theoretically be true, but then I think the fact that mutations inevitably will happen counteract any supposed way in which this could happen. I had this conversation with them too, but the way they compared that was with dog breeding. So they say, you take the wolf and then you compare that to like domestic dogs. The domestic dogs have less genetic diversity or whatever in their genome. And Artemis correctly pointed out, well, that's because we have artificial selection. So we're selecting for specific traits that we want.
Right.
It's very unnatural in a way. And then the subject got changed again. But equivocating selective breeding with the kind of breeding in populations that happens in nature, where you have hundreds or thousands of individuals, I just think is a really bad comparison.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, do you know who Adolphi is? I think his first name might be John.
I don't think so.
He runs the he runs this creation museum. So
I know of the Creation Museum, but I
he's the
didn't.
guy that always shows the things covered in rock. They're permineralized. He takes them to this place where like limestone rich water pours over something and then it gets caked in rock. And he says, see, all of Earth's geological features could have formed during the flood. It's
Right.
it's so silly. But he also says that Adam and Eve were 12 feet tall, and there was more oxygen in the atmosphere when Adam and Eve were around, and our genes were more pure. And I have no clue what that could possibly mean. Nobody does. There's no evidence to back up that claim or any of those claims. It's just pure conjecture.
Yeah.
Now, some people pretend that scientific inference is no better than just pure conjecture, but that's really not the case. I want to come back to the pure genome thing later, because that's part of genetic entropy too. One of the last things I wrote down was, I don't remember what was said. It was something Artemis said, something about evolution, genetics, something, or evolution. And one of them said, that's a presupposition. Or they also said, what you just said is an unfalsifiable claim. So that is, it's not even wrong, but it's a dirty little trick. Because even if that's true, that doesn't mean that like you have a good argument, or that what the other person is saying isn't justified beyond just the claim. So like when we're talking about something that happened, like me as a proponent of evolution, if I say, well, Ambulocetus lived part-time in the water, part-time on land, so there's selective pressure for the I don't know, for the hind limbs to change in a certain way, blah, blah, blah. And somebody says that's just an unfalsifiable claim. So like if both parties, if we can agree the past is unobservable, right? You would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So then we can ask, did the Civil War happen? And somebody may say yes. And then I can just say, well, that's an unfalsifiable claim because it can't be observed.
Well, actually,
right?
let me edit that statement. I think that there are certain elements in physics where technically we are observing the past.
If we, like if we look at things that are millions of light years away,
Yeah,
we're seeing them sort of in the past, but we don't see them as they exist in this moment.
right.
So, like in a way, we can't. How do I say this? We're looking at it. Say something's 5,000 light years away. We can't see it as it looked 6,000 years ago, only
Right.
5,000 years ago. So, kind of, but we also don't have like what it looks like in the present to compare
Right.
it to.
Correct.
But you're right about the farther we see in space, the farther back we see in time. There's this thing that I've heard Kent Hovind say it, and I heard them say it in the debate too. A fossil proves nothing other than an organism died. Which is really silly, because I mean, when you say that specific claim is really wild, because if you actually think about it, what you're saying is there can't be evidence of evolution.
Right.
If you're saying, because what evolution means is that organisms change over time, so the organisms of the past would be different than the ones of today. We all agree that that's what it has to mean, right? But if you say that no fossil could ever prove, and when they say prove, they really mean just be evidence of, then if you say that a fossil proves nothing, then the only conclusion you can draw from that is you're saying the evidence can't even exist. Or maybe the evidence could be there, but it could never, ever, ever be used in any way, which I think is like super dishonest. And it's not the way we think about anything else.
Yeah.
Like I was
that's
thinking,
the thing, right? Like they're so not skeptical about their own religious beliefs and their own dogmatism when it comes to that kind of thing. But then as soon as you get to the science, now they turn into like the most skeptics, like unreasonably even, to where now everything is like can be discarded if it doesn't provide some kind of certainty.
yeah.
And it's really, I think, hypocritical. Which
In a
again,
way.
and I think it shows that their motivation ultimately is not based on science. It's based on trying to kind of support the religious narrative.
Yeah, it's in the interest of preserving a worldview, but uh, we don't know that we're biased is the thing. The only person that doesn't know if you're acting biased is yourself, unfortunately. But like coming back to this thing about like the past is unobservable, that's just like nobody would say, like, if you say the Civil War happened and I just said, okay, well, that's just I believe it didn't, and no matter what you say, I'm just going to say that's a unfalsifiable claim. The evidence proves nothing. A photo just proves that somebody took a photo.
Yeah, like
A
everything
dead
is fake
body
news.
just proves that somebody died.
Right.
Now in science we don't deal with absolutes.
Right.
I know that you know that, but when all of the evidence only points in one direction, then that gives us the utmost confidence to say that we're pretty sure we know what's going on here.
Right.
And so, like I said a little bit ago, it's a dirty little trick, because what they're saying isn't false. It's just it really misses the point,
Which, by the way, based on what you just said, that's another reason why it's so dishonest when religious people call science a religion, because science isn't dealing with absolutes the way that religion does. It's not even functioning. It's not doing the same thing. It's not using the same methodology. It's so dishonest.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really I can't stand it at all. It's just so stupid, because there's no religion that doesn't have an element of the supernatural in it that I'm aware of. Um, and science is the exact opposite of that. Science is the rejection of those kinds of explanations for anything. And science makes predictions and tests its own claims. Religions just simply don't do that. You can argue that there have been prophets or something like that, but it but the idea of testing any of those claims to most people is like sort of offensive, and they take great offense to academics like Dan McClellan is like a superstar on TikTok, right?
Mhm.
And because he's a biblical scholar and he's very well spoken, he's like an encyclopedia, and man, people hate what he does.
Yeah, yeah,
Religious zealots hate what he
yeah.
does, I should say. What else? So they there was also the discussion of mitochondrial Eve
Mhm.
that happened in there at one point. Let me look for my notes here. So there's a couple different things to say about that. One, people have a really weird misconception about what mitochondrial Eve means. So it's true that if you look at like mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome DNA, that will get you back to most likely a single individual. Now, Artemis talked about there's actually a tribe; it's not an individual.
Right.
I can't remember where they lived. I want to say Zimbabwe, but I don't know if that's accurate or not.
I don't remember.
Um, but what a mitochondrial Eve is yes, it is a single person that we're all related to, but it's not the only person in the world. So, like, a way you could compare it is if every single person died tomorrow, except for one man and one woman, uh, and then somehow they had children and their children had children, and somehow that actually worked out. It wouldn't, but let's just say that it did. Um, she would be the mitochondrial Eve, but she clearly wasn't the first person. It's just that everybody from that point forward is directly related to her, and nobody else that was alive today before everybody else dies tomorrow. That's what a mitochondrial Eve is. Everybody or not everybody, but back in the past, mitochondrial Eve is thought to have lived like 250,000 years ago, or maybe 200,000 years ago. She wasn't the only Homo sapiens on the only female Homo sapiens on the planet. It's just that the others that were around, quite a lot of them had offspring, but eventually their offspring. Eventually, every single chain got broken except for one person.
Right.
That's what mitochondrial Eve is, and that's what a Y chromosome atom is.
Right.
It seemed like, I think people take the very existence of a mitochondrial Eve as somehow supporting evidence that there was at one point the very first human
Right.
that found it all true.
Which again goes back to just laziness. It's like not looking at the actual sciences in the detail. It's like picking out these words that are like, buzzwords to support their religious agenda.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I mean, if I'm being a little bit more generous, it sounds like exactly what you want to hear. And then the brain goes, oh, there it is.
right.
So there should be more rigor in it, but unfortunately there isn't. So I don't remember if they talked about this paper, but a lot of what they believe in comes from this guy, Robert Carter.
Mhm.
And he wrote a paper on mitochondrial Eve. So and Robert Carter did get like a PhD in, I'm not sure if it was genetics or some sort of like statistical field in genetics or something like that, but he really does. But he's also a young Earth creationist. So I looked at, oh yeah, they did bring this up because you may remember this. One of them said, oh, I have the most recent paper from
Yeah, yeah,
2007. And then Artemis said, okay, well, I have one from 2019. So I looked this up, and the name of the paper is The Eve Mitochondrial Consensus Sequence by Robert Carter and a couple other people. I think maybe the genetic entropy guy was also a co-author on it. And the genetic entropy guy, his name is Sanford. Is it Robert Sanford? I don't remember his first name. But anyways, I read that paper and I was like super shocked. Now, apparently there's two papers, and I'm pretty sure they're the exact same paper, but one was published in the Institute for Creation Research.
right.
So that's a young Earth creationist pseudoscientific website. The other was published in, I'm not sure if it was, it might have been the National Institute of Health or one of those. It was a government website, one of the big ones. I can't remember specifically which one, but it was heavily edited in order to be accepted, because I read through the abstract of that one too, and it appears to be the exact same thing. The exact same number of test subjects, 827, were used. It appeared to be doing the same thing. But let me just read to you what is in the, and this is where the thing they said in the beginning, well, our problem with it is more so the science, not our worldview. This is where I think that kind of falls apart. So science should be unbiased, but that paper that I looked up from that guy they referenced, it's like,
All
it's
bias.
insane. The very first words of the paper are, in order to develop a biblical model of human genetic history, ... So, I mean, right out the gate, that's the very first thing. Now, I think I don't
That's
have the, is this it? The mitochondrial diversity within human populations.
That right
Yeah,
there.
so yeah, the other version of it is, it's just completely different. It doesn't say the same things, but it's the same. It's the author doing the same thing just so that it could get published in a more official thing or whatever. But anyways, so I mean, that's just pure confirmation bias. It can't be anything else. They deliberately set out to back up a conclusion, and that's not how science works.
Yeah.
People are biased. Everybody is biased. So you can make the counterclaim that, well, science, so the scientists, they assume that humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, yada yada yada, so they're just doing confirmation bias too. But the problem is the methodology of this paper is biased, because science, like, you go into science with your hypothesis and you think you're right because it's based on evidence, but like, good science, what it does is it sets out to be like, well, I'm going to do everything I can to prove myself. Well, okay, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say you try to prove yourself wrong. That's not exactly what you're trying to do, but a good test is set up for that.
Right.
Whereas here, I mean, the way this has been set up is from the beginning in order to conform a worldview, because that's what it says here. And again, you can say, assuming evolution is true and an old Earth is confirmation bias too, but we never had those answers. How old is Earth? How long were humans around? We didn't have those answers once upon a time ago. We began with total ignorance. I mean, people probably didn't think it was 100 trillion years, right? And they also didn't think it was probably yesterday. But we had this sense of we don't know where it is. And just looking at the information through the most unbiased lens you can, which I think is science, gave us an objective answer. So yes, people like me do, or well, I'm not a scientist, but scientists that do think humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years do have that worldview and their like presumption about what it is, but that was gathered in an unbiased methodology.
So yeah, it's trusting. It's trust. This is why I think it's honest to call belief in science faith, because it's not arbitrary. Like it is based on what the actual evidence is and what it points to, and understanding the full context of how these theories have developed over time. Because they always say, they think it's a gotcha moment to be like, well, have you gone and done the experiments yourself? No, doesn't mean I have faith like in the religious sense, because I understand the difference in the types of methodologies. So
yeah, yeah. In principle, you could. I mean, nobody. Well, without getting into a debate about religion versus science, we can table that for now. Next thing. So the author in this paper, he says things like, most of the evolutionary assumptions have been questioned in the scientific literature. Now, when I got my master's degree, I had to write a research paper, and it's not fun because every time you make a claim, you have to or almost every time you make a claim, you have to back it up. So, you have to have a citation. Guess who the author cites when he says that?
Who?
Himself.
That's so embarrassing.
Yeah, so most of the evolutionary assumptions have been questioned in the scientific literature, and then he only cites himself. So I thought that was a little silly. The author, he rejects the methodologies of other mitochondrial papers, the ones that tell us that humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, on the grounds that those papers assume that we have shared common ancestry with other organisms. So he thinks that their methodology is flawed because they look at it with an evolutionary lens, right? He explicitly claims that the Genesis flood happened in his paper. He claims that the mitochondrial DNA data supports the Tower of Babel story, because in some studies, women have a higher migratory rate than men. And apparently in the Tower of Babel story, it says that people are scattered among their tribes according to paternal lineages. That's just like an insane level of cherry picking, right? So they actually use in the paper, he actually uses the phrase direct confirmation of the Babel account. And it's like, I thought the past was unobservable.
Right.
But then you can say that we have direct confirmation. But it's cherry picking because there are other mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies that show that in some groups the men travel more. Right. So it's just total cherry picking. I only have a few more, but the paper, it actually gets pretty ugly at one point in the paper towards the end. So the paper outright rejects the pretty clear reading of phylogenetic maps of the humans in Africa, and proposes a whole bunch of hypotheticals where there's zero evidence for. I mean, the author actually, this is when I read this, I was like, you got to be kidding me that he said that. So I don't know why these young Earth creationists it's almost like they take offense to the idea that we originated in Africa, which is really, really, really weird. I mean, they assert that it must have been somewhere in the Middle East near the Mediterranean or whatever. But so when we do the phylogenetic analysis, it appears humans came out of Africa. The author says, well, perhaps Africans have defective DNA repair systems. And that's why you see so much genetic diversity in Africa.
Well, that's concerning.
What kind of person that thinks that they're even remotely serious about anything would say something like that? It's so unbelievably gross.
That's racist.
Yeah. Well, it's not backed up by anything. Yeah. Like it's just saying something that needs to be true. It's like, well, the evidence clearly shows that the most genetic diversity in the world in humans is in Africa. Now, the reason for that is because we evolved there and only part of the population left Africa. So that means the entire world is colonized by a subset of the original human population, which is why everybody on Earth is genetically so similar to each other. And you find the most genetic diversity in Africa. So he has to invent this hypothetical that the DNA repair systems in Africans are defective, and that makes their genomes vary more and more. But yeah, I mean, it's just
that's insane.
It's pretty insane. What else? He also says analysis of the lifespans of the patriarchs shows that the average age of marriage changed dramatically downward in the first generations after the flood. So again, I don't even remember what that was supposed to prove. It was just another one of these hypothetical conjectures. But I mean, yeah, just asserting that the flood happened once again. They analyzed the apparently mitochondrial DNA of 827 people, but that really was hardly talked about at all in the paper. But he did talk about a computer simulation that they ran. So they ran a computer simulation to simulate like mitochondrial, like mutations in the mitochondrial DNA piling up over time to see if it would match today's population. But they gave their simulation a population size of only 1,000 people, which is an insanely small number. And they only ran it for 150 generations, which is an insanely short amount of time.
Yeah.
And they did that because, in the author's words, they wanted to be, quote, biblically reasonable. So this is, again, they've corrupted the methodology itself
to just fit into what they already want to be true.
Yeah. So like they ran this computer simulation and they tried to get it to show like, well, if there were only a few people and if we only have 150 generations, then voila, there you go. But it's so silly. Now, here's the other thing. If you look up the paper, it's published in the Journal of Creation, which is funded by the guy himself. I don't know if he works for them, but he is represented in the header as coming from this group called the Feed My Sheep Foundation.
Great.
And if you want to be shocked, go to their website, because their website is currently dedicated to the conspiracy that children are being taught sexually explicit content in schools, and that, in their own words, there is a sexual holocaust with billions of victims currently happening.
What does that even mean?
I don't know, because I couldn't make myself watch. They have videos. I don't want to watch them.
Right.
But billions of a sexual holocaust with billions of victims currently. Does this sound like an objective source?
Sounds like the type of conspiracy theories that people like, what is that one lunatic?
Alex Jones?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds very Alex Jonesy. But it's just, I mean, it's like a conflict of interest, kind of. I mean, this is like asking an oil company to investigate whether or not they were negligent in the oil spill happening.
Right.
And they come back and say no. Like, of course they're going to say no. So yeah, that was that paper.
That's so bad.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
The fact that we just quote that paper like it means anything.
Well, I'm not sure if they read that paper. I know one of them didn't read either paper, but I think the other brother, he was reading from the version of it that got published in the National Institutes of Health or whatever it was. But this is what the author really thinks. This is why the author wrote both papers. Right? So this clearly shows that rather than divorcing yourself from biblical arguments, the whole thing is framed in the light of them.
Right.
Do you want to talk about transitional fossils or genetic entropy next?
Let's go through transitional fossils first and then genetic entropy.
Sure. So Pachycetus got brought up in the debate, but it just, again, the subject just kept getting changed over and over and over again. There's tons of transitional fossils out there, I picked Pachycetus. So this is best done with pictures. I don't have the ability to share that, so I'll try to make this as easy to digest as possible. But if evolution is true, then what it means is that the species of today are the descendants of different species from the past. And if we can find their fossils, we should be able to find evidence of them or of that. So, like the one something in evolution that we talk about are what we call highly derived traits. So that is a trait or characteristic that organisms share, but have become like, how do I want to say, but have become highly, highly, highly specialized. So, like for example, if you look at a horse's legs, either its front legs or its hind legs, we find is horses are really bizarre. They walk on just their middle finger. So horses are always flipping you off, and they walk on their toenail. So we have this really weird animal that doesn't have any other fingers. They have some little vestiges that stick out. There's a name for those. I can't remember what they are. But so we have horses are mammals. They're land vertebrates. Virtually all other terrestrial land mammals have 5 digits or 4 on the feet and hands, so to speak. So if horses are the product of evolution, then what we should find is the ancestors of horses should gradually have, we should see that robust middle finger gradually becoming smaller over time. And then they were walking on more than 1 digit. And I mean, that's exactly what we find, right? So that's what a highly derived trait is. Whereas like a bird's wing, like you and me, a bird has 1 bone that attaches to the trunk of the body, 2 bones in the forearm, wrists, and like finger bones. But in a bird, it's really weird. Their fingertips are fused together in pretty much all birds, except for a few flightless birds. So it's highly derived, right? So I just wanted to like begin with that.
Yeah.
So we have all kinds of evidence of this for whales. Now, if you look at Pachycetus, it's really weird. It looks like some sort of giant, almost like a shrew, but it has tiny hooves on its feet and a really long tail. It's kind of a really weird looking animal, but it has there's all kinds of things that tell us it's an early divergent from the common ancestor between whales and their closest relatives. And it has traits that only whales have too. So for example, there's something called a tympanic bulla. So this is just part of your temporal bone is the bone on the side of your skull. It's where our ear hole is. And the tympanic bulla in them, it's thick and it's really dense. And we only see that. It helps with hearing underwater. And the only animals that currently have that are cetaceans, dolphins, and whales. Pachycetus also has that. So it's a trait that stuck around and became more and more modified. Now you could just say that's coincidence. Okay. We have these things called bunodont molars. So the Pachycetus, its molars have like rounded cusps on them. So that's a morphology that we only see in a few animals. So artiodactyls are when we say ungulates, those are animals that have hooves. But there's 2 different groups of those. There's artiodactyls and then perissodactyls, I think. Artiodactyls are even-toed ones. So anything where its hooves are cloven in 2s or in or in 4s, for example. So that's most animals with hooves that we think of. And it turns out that guess what whales are most closely genetically related to? Artiodactyls, right? But Ambulocetus and Basilosaurus have this too. So neither Pachycetus nor Ambulocetus look like whales. They really don't. But they have the original traits that then became passed down into whales, right. For the most part. But Basilosaurus really does clearly look like a whale. I mean, Ambulocetus and Pachycetus could have walked on land. Basilosaurus definitely could not have. But if you've ever seen, so there's 2 different groups of whales. One are the baleen whales. So they have the teeth that look like feathers because their strainers. They aren't really filter feeders. They gulp stuff up, then they push the water out with their tongues, and krill gets stuck in the baleen, and then they eat it. And then there are the toothed whales. So that would be all dolphins, but then there's also sperm whales and orcas, and belugas and narwhals, I believe, and probably a few others. Well, modern day whales, all their teeth look exactly the same. They're called homodonts, homo as in same. But Basilosaurus, which is clearly a whale, still has distinctly different teeth. The teeth are really weird looking in Basilosaurus. They're really cool. I wish I had one I could show you. But the back molars still have the two different tooth morphology. So much like the way we see ancient birds still have teeth and beaks, but gradually they lost all their teeth and they have beaks. The tooth morphology of whales clearly shows that it changed over time. And the tooth morphology that Pachycetus has is later seen in Ambulocetus and Basilosaurus too. There's a bone in the foot as well. It's called the talus bone. Sometimes it's called the astragalus. So our bones have where one bone touches another is called an articulation. So you'll see a smooth surface there. So in this talus bone in Pachycetus, there are two articulations. Basically, like think of your femur. Everybody knows, when you draw a bone, you draw a line and then you draw those two bumps.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the articulations. And that's exactly what our femur looks like. Right. The talus bone in Pachycetus has two of those rather than one. Now, in virtually all mammals, or in the vast majority of mammals, there's just one articulation there. But Pachycetus has it, and so do the artiodactyls. They have it too. And then we also see it in Ambulocetus. And I'm not sure about Basilosaurus. Its legs became really, really... It does have hind flippers or legs, but they got really, really diminished. So the bone morphology may not be there anymore. But again, genetic testing. So like the fossil record, we knew which animals were related to which extinct or like, how do I say this? We knew what animals were closely related in the present based on the fossil record before we could do anything with genetic testing. There were all these predictions, like the Archaeopteryx clearly looks like the transition from dinosaur to bird, right? And these clearly look like the common ancestor of the artiodactyls and the whales, because it has so many features that they both have. And then once we had the ability to do genetic testing, it perfectly matched what the fossil record predicted. And I mean, that's the power of science. That's the thing that lets us know that our scientific ideas are good.
And those novel predictions is precisely what religion can't produce in the same way.
Say that again, sorry.
Those novel predictions is exactly what religion doesn't produce in the same way.
No, yeah, you're right. I mean, I've asked people to like give me a prediction, something, because like some people say like the Bible has science in it or something like that. I ask them to give me a prediction of something we don't know yet, and they never can, because people that say that, all they're doing is reading the words in light of current evidence. Right. To make it match, because the words don't literally say hardly anything at all a lot of the time. It's just these elastic words, this sort of vague poetry that can mean whatever you need it to mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry. So that bone that I was talking about, the astragalus, that is actually, it's in my notes. I should have read it a little further. That is also found in Basilosaurus. Now, you can deny, again, Pachycetus doesn't look like a whale, but Basilosaurus is very, very clearly an extinct whale. That there's no other kind of animal that it could have been. It had to have been some sort of whale. So to admit that it shares a key diagnostic feature with Pachycetus and artiodactyls, which are its closest genetic relatives of whales today, is to just believe in the most like insanely narrow coincidences ever, basically. with regard to whales, the other thing, this would be best done with a photograph, but if you ever like look up the hind limbs of Basilosaurus, so whales today do not have hind limbs at all. They just have main flippers in the front, and then they have a tail fluke. The reason
Mhm.
they don't need hind limbs is because they have such a large tail fluke. There are other, like seals don't have tail flukes, so they have pretty robust hind limbs as well. Or some of the extinct like plesiosaurs, those are like the Loch Ness monster type things.
Mhm.
They didn't have tail flukes, so they had powerful front and hind flippers
Right.
as well. Now whales don't need that because of the tail fluke. So um, what lost my train of thought for a second there. So I'll just come back to the beginning here. If you look at the hind limbs of Basilosaurus, um, and Dorudon, that's another extinct whale. It clearly shows that they have those hind limbs have the same morphology as land-dwelling animals, but they weren't used for locomotion. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the front flipper of a whale, you'll see that it does have the same bones. There's one bone that attaches to the trunk, two here, some wrist bones, and then some short bones for your digits. Uh, those bones in that order are there, but it looks nothing like the limb of any land dwelling animal, except
Mm.
except arguably for some moles, because what it uses those flippers for is to make it move, and
Right.
whales are huge, right? Now moles, because they have to dig, they have really powerful front limbs. So what you see is the bones are extremely thick and kind of weird shaped. That's what we see in whales. So that kind of morphology in the front flippers of whales, it's very clearly not for walking around. Now, but again, if you look at the hind limbs of Basilosaurus and its hind limbs, it was basically the equivalent of T-Rex's front arms. So like really incredibly tiny, probably had some sort of function, but obviously not for locomotion, obviously not for grabbing prey, right? And in Basilosaurus, these hind legs or the hind limbs or whatever, they didn't use them for swimming or walking. Now, what's interesting about that is the legs just look like really small legs. It's not like the front limbs where the bones got dramatically changed. The bones are not dramatically changed in the back, they're just smaller.
Mm.
So the reason for that is because there's intense selective pressure on the flippers in the front to change, because that's how it moves around. But the hind limbs had almost no selective pressure on them whatsoever, except to gradually shrink and go away because they're not needed. It's just wasted energy to grow tissue that the
Right.
animal doesn't need. So that causes the gross anatomy to be conserved and just diminish in size, because there's nothing else about the hind limb that needs to change. Just make it smaller, if that makes any sense. Um, so I know that was a lot of information, but
Oh,
hopefully,
it's good.
hopefully people know what I mean by that. And then the final thing is with like the Pachycetus, the Ambulocetus, Dorudon, Basilosaurus, the fossils are found in completely different strata, completely different rock layers, meaning these animals did not coexist. And then that's been confirmed with radiometric dating. So again, you have to claim that just all of those things are just crazy coincidences, or you have to just say that radiometric dating isn't accurate when there's, I mean, it
Right.
is.
Yeah. Another point. This is a separate issue, but talking about how they just sort of reject all the evidence provided was when we talked about retroviruses, and how they just were ignoring how that is a piece of evidence for evolution. Um, uh, and there was, again, it was more like they were just claiming it was just a coincidence, that it was just that somehow the fact that we would see these viruses being passed on, um, somehow wouldn't be evidence of evolution in the way that we believe it. It's like, well, what is your competing theory for retroviruses? I don't think they even knew what they were.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. The people that deny evolution will give you like the odds they'll say the odds
Right,
of even
exactly,
a
right,
single
right,
blank 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 forming are 1 to the 80th power, or
right,
1
right.
over 10 to the 80th power, something like that. And Artemis was like, yeah, the odds of us having all but, I think it was 1 or 2 of the endogenous retrovirus insertion sites in our DNA with chimps is like 1 to the, I can't remember what she said. It was like
Yeah,
some insane number. But yeah, endogenous retroviruses, I mean, those are hard to dissect, because it is kind of, it's hard to understand exactly why or what it means. I honestly, I struggle with it. I get it, but I'm not very good at reframing that argument. I never use it. Every time
mhm,
somebody says it, I'm like, I follow what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The one thing that a creationist should ask, which this is the question I have that I haven't had time to research, is how do we know that those chunks of DNA in the genome come from a virus? Like, I'm sure there's some sort of genetic marker that tells us that
mhm,
that's the only place it makes sense where it would have came from. But I don't know what that is. So that would be the good question to ask that nobody ever does. Because like you said, I don't think they even know what you're saying when you tell them that.
right.
Um, so I have some stuff about genetic entropy, and then
Yeah,
that's pretty much all I
yeah,
had.
that
So
sounds good. I mean, yeah, that's good. We're almost at the hour mark, so that's a good point time to get in there.
so what genetic entropy is in the debate, Artemis said, oh yeah, genetic entropy's been debunked, and then one of them said, no, it hasn't. It's basically confirmed by every geneticist, and that's not true at all.
Yeah,
And for reasons I'll get into later, these guys, I don't think even they shouldn't use genetic entropy, because it doesn't work with their worldview either, because they believe in natural selection, and genetic entropy basically says natural selection isn't a thing. um, but what it is it's the idea that it's popularized by this guy named, I think it's John Sanford. So he claims that almost all mutations are harmful, that mutations constantly accumulate and always become more common in the gene pool. There was an original, like the original population during creation or whatever, had like a more pure genome, and we've been getting farther and farther away from it ever since. That's basically the crux of it. Most of the problems with it stem from the idea that or the claim that most mutations are harmful is, I mean, there's nothing
yeah,
to back that up at all. I mean, and like I said, it doesn't even agree with their worldview, because again, they think that species radiated after the arc. The only way for that to be possible is for changes in the genome to happen, and those are mutations, and they have to be beneficial. It just makes no sense. I'd like to ask Sanford his thoughts on that, because I don't see how you can possibly reconcile that. Um, so yeah, one of the big one of the major problems is it just completely ignores the way that natural selection works. So, even if most mutations were harmful, it wouldn't really necessarily matter, because individuals with harmful mutations don't pass down their genes nearly as often as those that do not have harmful mutations. And also, the vast majority of organisms never even reproduce. So you'd have to believe that every single organism always inherits several harmful mutations, and reject the idea that some mutations or that some organisms are more fit to their environment. Or you'd have to believe that every single member contributes to reproduction. And none of those things is how anything works in nature. There've been experiments done on this. You can do like forced inbreeding experiments. They do them with yeast. So what you do is you take a population. In the study I looked at, they took yeast and they graph their fitness. And fitness is just measured by how well they reproduce. So you take all your yeast and then you graph their fitness. So you get a really tight bell curve over 1. So that's the standard rate at which they reproduce, and most of them fall really close to within the norm there, right? What you do is you force the yeast to, I don't know how you do this with yeast, but you force them to inbreed over and over again. And what you see is that bell curve goes from really tight to extremely long, especially at the tail end, right? So what that when you remove doing forced inbreeding means you've removed natural selection
Right.
from it, because the reasons that organisms are reproducing don't have all that much to do with them trying to negotiate or survive their way through their environment. It's us just forcing it in a completely random way, right? So because the fitness gradually, weirdly, you get more individuals with higher fitness than you normally do, but you get a lot that have really low fitness. So what that shows is the data. The data clearly show that natural selection cures a population of harmful mutations. Because like in the normal case, you don't have that really wide distribution of fitness. So there you go. Even if obviously some mutations can be harmful, and inbreeding brings them out, but natural selection cures a population of that.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that encyclopedia of information. Yeah, it seems to me that this is what happens when you have people that are not um, well versed in the science, who are trying to kind of cherry pick things that they read, half understood, to then try to fit into a religious worldview to justify their own dogmas. And I think that's what was going on there in their entire conversation. They don't realize they're even contradicting themselves half the time.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to ask is kind of a separate issue, and I'm not sure if I can even express this in a way that will make sense, but do you agree that when it comes to understanding the function of whether it's like different organs or the way that system seems to behave in nature, or even just like the laws of physics themselves, we get to a point where we can't ask a further why, right? There is just a brute fact of the matter that these things seem to operate in this way or have evolved in this way to have these functions. And there's not a clear explanation as to why. It just is the case. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I think so. So like why does natural selection favor certain things versus others?
Right.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I mean, a religious minded person would say that the reason anything happens is because there's an ultimate plan that's put out there, right? But a lot of people, the idea of natural selection and evolution is really sour with them because it's an unintelligent, unconscious process. In that those words got used a couple times when I was discussing with them. It just seems like they don't like the idea
Right.
because there's no agency behind it, right?
Right.
But the universe isn't random. That's another thing. That what's usually attached with that is a random how could a random process create life? Like, it's not random. The reason like, first of all, the laws of physics are completely non-random, like, at all. If we lived in a random universe, we couldn't do science, because every time
because we
because you
do see
need
patterns.
the ability to repeat experiments in science. If we lived in a random universe, that would be impossible. Things would fall at different rates. Sometimes they would float, I guess. Light would travel at different speeds all the time. That would be a wild universe. It would be horrible. I would hate it. But
they seem to think that the fact that it's not random is evidence of a god.
yeah, and then they just move the goalpost. We're like, see, that proves this other thing. It's like, okay, we weren't talking about that, right?
But even there, it's like, well, you haven't explained why it is that your god has the nature that it has to be what it is. Like, you can always ask a further why is this the case, and ultimately you just get to it just is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some whys, like kind of like what I was talking about. Like, the reason natural selection can work is because we do live in a non-random universe, and then also, like, why do when it comes to life is just the product of physical non-living chemistry, Why do chemical reactions happen? Because matter is always trying to rearrange in order to form a lower energy state, right? That seems like a weird thing to be able to allow. That seems like a weird description of life, but at its like, if you reduce it all the way down um to that level, to like the smallest element, that's where you end up. So for example, something like humans don't have the ability to make vitamin C anymore, right? How could that be beneficial? Well, there were available foods in our environment where we could get vitamin C. And so us not making it anymore actually conserves energy within us. So there we go, a lower energy state. Less metabolic work is being done. That's beneficial.
Right.
That is something that an organism would favor. That's why animals that live in caves, troglodytes, tend not to have eyes, right? Or non-functioning eyes,
Right.
so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's all really interesting stuff. And like I said, I appreciate you coming back on to kind of dive into some of the details, because like you were saying, I think that conversation kind of got derailed because it was like moving from point to point to point without like a coherent, uh, I don't know, pattern, or without really like, I don't know. I just felt like they were kind of throwing things at the wall, and every time a point was made, it was like a
Yeah,
moving on
kind
from
of.
that, and it kind of got derailed in that way. But you know, yeah. So maybe if they ever do come back, um, I'll have you on as well as Artemis to kind of help keep that
Yeah,
in
that'd be
track.
fine with me.
But yeah, is there anything else you wanted to say before we get going?
No, I mean that pretty much covers it, I think.
All right. Anybody in the audience, if you have any questions before I uh, turn or end the stream, let me know real quick. In the meantime, like if well, thank you first of all. Anybody that comes in here to support what we're doing, I always appreciate it very much. Do you want to plug your TikTok account?
Yeah, if you just look me up, Planet Peterson, that's what although I did change my name on TikTok, it's just an inside joke. But if you type in Planet Peterson, you should still find me. And then my YouTube is Planet Peterson too. I should be the only thing that pops up when you do that. Although you do get some Jordan Peterson videos too. And then I have an Instagram too, Planet Peterson. Should be easy to find.
Mine is Cease to Know on TikTok. I try to do a live every day. Hopefully, I can put out more content on here more often. And still trying to get everything balanced. But all right, I appreciate you coming on, and I'll see you guys all next time. So I hope everybody has a safe night.